In the summer of 1987, a young New Jersey mother is found brutally murdered. The case shocks her community, but when an arrest is made not long afterward, many believe the person responsible has been caught. Decades later, advances in DNA testing reveal that the man convicted of her murder could not have been the killer. The discovery exposes a wrongful conviction, sends the investigation back to the beginning, and leaves her family once again searching for answers. Today, the hope is that the same evidence that freed the wrong man may finally identify the right one. I'm your host, Megan, and each week on A Simpler Time True Crime, I cover older unsolved cases and challenge the idea that a simpler time meant a safer time. This week, I'm bringing to you the unsolved murder of Jackie Harrison. Hi everyone, and thank you for joining me for another episode. The case I'm about to tell you about is one I first came across in a Wall Street Journal article about exonerations. The article is about 10 years old now, and I'll link it in the show notes because it's well worth the read. What stuck with me wasn't just the legal side of the story, it was the perspective it highlighted, one that I think can sometimes get overlooked. When we hear about a wrongful conviction, our attention understandably goes to the person who spent years, sometimes decades, in prison for a crime they didn't commit. I think that's because most of us grow up believing the criminal justice system is designed to separate the guilty from the innocent. We want to believe that if we were truly innocent, we could never end up behind bars. History has shown us that isn't always true. Before modern forensic testing, convictions often relied heavily on eyewitness testimony, forensic techniques that have since been discredited, jailhouse informants, and a number of other factors that we now know could lead to devastating mistakes. And we absolutely should care about the people whose lives were stolen by those wrongful convictions. But they aren't the only people whose lives are changed forever. Once someone is exonerated, our focus usually shifts to another question. If this person didn't do it, then who did? Is the real killer still out there? Those are important questions, but in the middle of those conversations, it can be easy to lose sight of another group of people living through the consequences of that exoneration: the victim's family. Imagine believing for years or even decades that the person responsible for your loved one's murder has been identified and held accountable. Then one day you're told they couldn't have been the killer. Even if you believe the exoneration is the right outcome, it doesn't erase the grief. It adds another layer to it. Suddenly you're back to where you started, still mourning the person you lost while also realizing the investigation is no longer over. Today's episode isn't about questioning an exoneration. It's about what comes after one. I don't want to speak for Jackie Harrison's family. Instead, I want to amplify what they have shared over the years. I want to tell you Jackie's story, walk through the investigation and the wrongful conviction that followed, and help keep attention on her case in the hope that the person who took her life is one day identified. Before we begin, I do want to give a quick warning that this episode includes a discussion of a sexual assault. A few of those details are important to understanding the evidence presented at trial and the later DNA testing. But as always, I'll only include what's necessary to tell the story. And with that, let's get into it. In 1987, Pemberton, New Jersey was a community of about 10,000 people in Burlington County, roughly 30 miles east of Philadelphia. The area combined residential neighborhoods with wooded landscapes, open fields, and small local businesses, offering a mixture of suburban and rural surroundings. Children attended neighborhood schools, families gathered around local parks and youth sports, and many residents traveled into neighboring towns or toward Philadelphia for work, shopping, and entertainment. Nearby Fort Dix and McGuire Air Force Base also brought new faces to the community, adding to a population that included many families who had called the area home for generations. 25-year-old Jacqueline Harrison was known to family and friends simply as Jackie. She was raising two young daughters, ages 6 and 3, while living with her mother, Eloise, in the family's home on Amherst Avenue. The arrangement gave Jackie a strong support system as she balanced work and raising two little girls on her own. During the day, she worked as a kitchen aide at the New Lisbon Developmental Center. As a brief side note, the New Lisbon Developmental Center is still operating today as a state-run facility serving adults with intellectual and developmental disabilities. Care has changed significantly over the years, but during much of the 20th century, institutions like New Lisbon reflected a very different approach to supporting people with disabilities. Many residents experienced conditions that today would be considered unacceptable, and there is a long, complicated history surrounding facilities like this across the country that had institutionalized care. If you ever decide to go down that rabbit hole, there are even a few unresolved missing persons cases connected to the campus from more than a decade before Jackie worked there. I don't want to get too far off track because those cases have no known connection to hers, but I also didn't want to mention New Lisbon without acknowledging its history because some of my listeners may be familiar with it, and it may be a sensitive topic. At the same time, it's important to separate the institution from the people who worked there. Like many others, Jackie showed up each day with her heart in the right place, preparing foods and supporting vulnerable individuals. Good people often work within imperfect systems, and those systems evolve because people continue pushing for better care. By all accounts, Jackie was one of those hardworking and caring people. In a later interview with NPR's Michelle Norris for the show All Things Considered, Jackie's daughter Andrea, who was 3 at the time of her mother's murder, described her last memory of her. She said that her mother had been working on the day of Sunday, August 23, 1987. Andrea and her sister were in the care of their aunt and grandmother, and they were going out to run some errands that evening, and as they were pulling out down the street, her mother was driving to go back home. They sort of waved out the window to each other, and Jackie's daughters tried to convince their mother to come out with them. And she said to her mother, "Mom, you can come too." And she told them she was tired, she just got off of work, and she was going to take a little nap, but to have fun. And that was that. Based on the available source material, it sounds like Jackie's mom, Eloise, was expecting to watch the girls the whole day and through the night. It wasn't unusual for Jackie to go out at night and let loose a little. Jackie had first become a mother as a teenager and then again in her early 20s. And parenting that young can be a push and pull between wanting to be the best mom you can be and also live that life that many of your peers your age are living and be carefree. Jackie's friendship circle was known to party, and crack cocaine was rampant both at the time and in that area. Jackie was known to recreationally use drugs and drink alcohol. By all accounts, that moment that Andrea remembered of passing her mother on the road, that occurred around 6:30 p.m. that Sunday evening. It's what Eloise would later tell police. And what happened after that is somewhat of a mystery, though there's lots of little pieces people have put together. When the girls returned home that evening, their mother wasn't home, and she never came home that night. But again, Eloise did not immediately get worried or think to call police because her daughter often went out and stayed out. As Monday wore on, though, Jackie's loved ones felt something wasn't right. By Monday evening, her sister Patricia called the police. She got an officer on the phone and said, "I'd like to report my sister missing." But instead of the usual pushback or a mandated delay in filing a report, the officer surprised her by asking, what was she wearing? Patricia remembered Jackie's outfit clearly and described what she was wearing all the way down to the purse she was carrying. And without a beat, the officer just said to her, "Your sister was found murdered a couple of houses down, one street over." Patricia couldn't even place what the officer was saying. No buffer, no officer coming to the door in uniform to make a notification, just a phone conversation with the casual tone as if he could have been telling her about the weather. Patricia said that in the room with her was her other sister and her infant son crawling around at her feet. Her mother was there and Jackie's girls, and they were all just in the room as this officer just tells her that Jackie is dead. The officer's statement that Jackie had been murdered a couple of houses down wasn't entirely accurate. She wasn't found at a house at all. On Monday, August 24th, just after 7 p.m., a neighborhood woman was walking her dog along a dirt road through the woods behind University Avenue, adjacent to a soybean field, only a short distance from Jackie's home. As she made her way down the trail, she came across a sight she would likely never forget: the partially clothed body of a young woman. It was immediately apparent that her death was suspicious. The woman called police, who responded to the scene and began their investigation. A short time later, Jackie's sister contacted authorities to report her missing. The description matched the unidentified victim, and before long, the family's worst fears were confirmed. The woman found in the woods was Jackie. Just as a heads up, this next part is where I will go into the details of the crime, which are honestly really hard to even speak of, and they're pretty graphic. I promise I'm only sharing them because they tie to the forensic evidence in the case. But if you want to skip over them, I recommend skipping ahead about 45 seconds from here. Police couldn't immediately tell what caused Jackie's death. There were no gunshot wounds or stab wounds. The autopsy would reveal far more information. It was determined that next morning that Jackie had been sexually assaulted and strangled to death. During the commission of the sexual assault, she had been tortured, and nearby tree branches and sticks had been used in this process and during the commission of the sexual assault. When she was penetrated with one of the sticks, a piece had broken off inside her and was found during the autopsy. A separate 8-inch stick was found forced down her throat, and the autopsy revealed that she was still alive when that happened. Just absolutely horrible. It was first estimated that Jackie had been dead for about 17 hours when her body was found, so that would have placed her time of death a little after midnight in those early morning hours of Monday morning, though eventually the timeline would get narrowed down to more like 2 a.m. to 6 a.m. Years later, during an interview with NPR's Michelle Norris of All Things Considered, Jackie's family reflected on how the public remembered her. They said people knew the details of her death, but very little about the life she had lived. They didn't know that Jackie grew up in an army family and spent parts of her childhood in places like Alaska and Germany. They didn't know that she graduated from Pemberton Township High School in 1980. They didn't know about her dreams or how much she loved being a mother. Much of the media coverage also centered on Jackie's social life. Like many 25-year-olds, she enjoyed going out with her friends when she had a chance. When she did, her daughters were cared for by her mother, sister, and other members of their family who loved them. But some of the reporting at the time reduced Jackie to the idea that she was a partier, a characterization her family felt overlooked who she really was, and at times seemed to invite judgment that had little to do with finding the person responsible for her murder. As I've said before on this podcast, two things can be true. We don't need to sanitize the details of someone's life and pretend they didn't have complexities or struggles or rough moments. I mean, don't we all? But we also don't need to reduce people to that either. One of the people who can speak to her lifestyle at the time is Dwayne Jones, who was the father of Andrea, Jackie's 3-year-old at the time. He told the Wall Street Journal that they were in an on-again, off-again relationship at the time, and they spoke of getting married, but that she was, quote, involved in some stuff that she shouldn't have been, end quote. It was his belief that Jackie went out with other drug users from the neighborhood that night, and at some point she stumbled into her killer, be it a stranger or someone from that crowd. Much of Jackie's night has never been put together, but here's what we do know. She was using crack cocaine that night, and police were able to establish that she had consensual sex with 2 men, a man named David and one named Arthur. Both men were transparent about this in early interviews, and this was on record. According to an article in the Times from 1987, Burlington County prosecutor Stephen Raymond stated that they also had a witness come forward who said they saw Jackie that evening with a man named Larry Leon Peterson, and that it was the last person they saw Jackie with. Larry was 11 years older than Jackie, but had known her for a few years and was considered an acquaintance of hers. In a separate witness statement, a woman came forward in the few days after Jackie's murder and said that she noticed Larry Peterson had scratches all over his arms. This was repeated by an ex-boyfriend of Jackie's as well. This, of course, certainly prompted authorities to look at him a little harder. Larry Peterson told NPR that 2 detectives came to visit him at his workplace. He said, quote, "And they said, well, we want to only talk to you. I have nothing to talk to you about." They say, "Well, you're not going to talk to us?" I said, "No." They said, "Well, if you don't, you're under arrest." I said, "Okay, let's talk. What are we going to talk about?" They said, "We want to talk about someone that got killed." I told them at that time I didn't know anything. I didn't know anybody that did anything. And as far as I'm concerned, they was barking up the wrong tree. End quote. Now, whether or not he said he was with Jackie at all that night, that's unclear, but he told police that during the time of the murder, he had an alibi. He said he was at the nearby Wrightstown Motel with a woman named Susan that night. She was a woman he was seeing. He said he remembered the date because he had actually shoplifted a bottle of liquor that night from a store in Fort Dix. When questioned, Susan said she was with Larry and backed up his story. But when police dug in further, the hotel didn't have any record of a room being under Larry or Susan's name on the night of the murder. Larry had a reason for that. He said that he and Susan used fake names for any number of reasons you can imagine. As far as the scratches, Larry had a reason for those too. He told investigators that to help make money, he would go out into the woods and collect wild vines, the same ones sold in craft stores to make decorative wreaths, and that an occupational hazard of that was very big scratches. Larry would later admit in an interview with NPR that he was not living a life that was completely on the up and up at the time. He said, quote, "I became involved with the wrong people. I abused various substances and just fell into a rut. Alcohol, drugs, nightlife, riotous living. That was my downfall." But he insisted that it didn't cross the line into the types of crimes he was being looked at in Jackie's case. But the more Larry tried to clear his name, the more things came out that made him look like a suspect. Police began interviewing friends of his, including his friend and colleague, Robert Elder. In their first interview with Elder, this was within days of the crime on August 31st, 1987. In a second interview, right thereafter, Elder agreed to a polygraph test, and according to the results, he was withholding information. After this polygraph exam, Robert Elder gave much more detailed accounts of an alleged conversation that he said took place during a car ride to work with Larry Peterson and 2 other coworkers, just hours after Jackie was murdered. According to Elder, Peterson admitted that he had sex with a woman whose name sounded like Jackie's, assaulted her, choked her, and that he then inserted a stick into her body. Prosecutors argued that this detail was especially significant because investigators had never released this information to the public. Now, it says this on record, but I have newspaper clippings from prior to Elder ever being interviewed that openly discuss that detail. So I'm not exactly sure why they spun it that way or how. It's simply not true. And the absolute depravity of this crime was discussed openly the day the story broke, which was the day after her body was found. Nevertheless, on September 21st, 1987, detectives got statements from the other 2 men who were in the car, Wesley Bishop and Arthur Grooms. They corroborated Robert Elder's account of the car conversation. And then it was announced all over the news. An arrest had been made in the brutal murder. Larry Leon Patterson had been arrested. He was later indicted on capital murder charges and sexual assault, and in a December of '87 court appearance, he pleaded not guilty to all charges. He remained in jail awaiting trial in lieu of a $500,000 bail, which, adjusted for inflation, that would be nearly $1.5 million in 2026. Interesting piece of New Jersey trivia. This was a death penalty case because in 1987, New Jersey had the death penalty still on the table. It no longer does. In 2006, they got rid of it and commuted sentencing to life without parole for those convicted of capital murder. However, even though they had death penalty cases, nobody in New Jersey has been executed since 1963. With the arrest of Larry Peterson, Jackie's family felt some relief. It didn't erase the horrible way her life was taken or bring her back, but they could at least be at peace that the person who committed the crime was off the streets and not out there ready to harm the next woman. The very night Peterson got to jail, he was beaten by fellow inmates due to the details of the crime. Men who commit crimes like the one against Jackie are not received well in the prison hierarchy, and he ended up needing to be placed in isolation for some time. Before I get into the parts about the trial, just be aware that some of those earlier details come back into play now as they go through the evidence. In March of '89, the trial finally got underway. Assistant prosecutor Michael Riley said, quote, "We don't have a videotape of Mr. Peterson murdering Jackie Harrison. What we have is a web of circumstantial evidence. When it all accumulates, there's really only one conclusion, and that is that Mr. Peterson is guilty of murder." Peterson's defense attorney was a man named John Furlong. He opened by writing "not guilty" in large print on a display pad in the front of the courtroom. He followed up by saying, quote, "Mr. Larry Peterson is not guilty of murder, he is not guilty of sexual assault, and he is not guilty of anything. He is presumed innocent." He also went on to say that they had already suggested there are others who had both motive and opportunity to kill Jackie Harrison. In the trial, the prosecution elaborated on more of the statements from Larry Peterson's coworkers and discussed how Larry Peterson told them that he beat Jackie, which was consistent with the bruising on her face, and how he talked about choking her, which the autopsy revealed she died from manual strangulation. It was then reported that Peterson told his coworkers, quote, "Then I took a stick and I hit her in the face with the stick and I jammed the stick down her throat," end quote. He then allegedly said that she refused sex with him, so he raped her. Prosecutors painted the picture that Peterson then had to kill her because she could identify him, which would make sense because we know that Peterson and Jackie were acquainted with one another. John Furlong argued differently. He told the jurors that no one saw or heard the crime and that the state's case was based on, quote, hair and hearsay. He said, quote, "There is no firsthand direct evidence of how the crime was committed. This is a case of gossip. Gossip is why Larry Peterson is here today." I mentioned hair, and you're probably wondering more about that. At trial, one of the most important pieces of physical evidence came from the hair samples collected during the investigation. A forensic scientist with the New Jersey State Police Laboratory System testified that her microscopic hair comparison analysis linked Larry Peterson to Jackie's murder. She told jurors that 3 foreign pubic hairs recovered during Jackie's examination shared the same physical microscopic characteristics as Peterson's. She also testified that a head hair fragment recovered from the bag used to transport Jackie's body compared to Peterson's hair. Finally, she examined the stick found about 40 feet from Jackie's body and concluded that it contained 3 of Jackie's pubic hairs, 1 of her head hairs, and 3 pubic hairs that also compared to Peterson's. At the time, that testimony carried a tremendous amount of weight. DNA testing wasn't yet being used the way it is today, so investigators relied heavily on comparing hairs under a microscope. The forensic scientist also examined hair samples from the 2 men investigators determined had consensual sex with Jackie on the night of her murder. She testified that neither man could have been the source of the hair she examined. The defense challenged how much weight the jury should give that testimony, arguing that the hairs were not the actual, quote, match. Prosecutor John Furlong responded that this was an important distinction. The forensic scientist wasn't saying that the hairs definitively belonged to Larry Peterson. Instead, she testified that they compared, meaning they shared the same microscopic characteristics. Furlong argued that was exactly what the science allowed her to say. But for the jurors listening in 1989, that distinction may not have mattered much. They just heard testimony that multiple hairs recovered from Jackie's body, the body bag, and the stick used in the assault all compared to Larry Peterson's, adding what appeared to be powerful physical evidence to the state's case. On St. Patrick's Day, 1989, the jury reached its verdict. Jurors were having difficulty reaching one, though, and deliberated into the evening. Ultimately, Larry Leon Peterson was found guilty of felony murder in Jackie's case. Essentially, they found him guilty of causing the death of Jackie Harrison while he was sexually assaulting her, but he was acquitted on 2 counts of capital murder. That meant that the jury would not enter the death penalty phase of the trial. As for these 6 sexual assault charges, he was found guilty of 4 and acquitted of 2. Outside of the courtroom, Jackie's family was relieved. Her sister Glenda told the press, quote, "I'm just really thankful for the way it turned out. For a while, we didn't think it would turn in our favor. He doesn't deserve to be on the streets." She also said she was glad he would not be sentenced to death, saying, "I think he'll suffer a lot more. He'll be around to realize what he did." End quote. For years, Peterson remained behind bars. Though dealing with the immense pain of losing Jackie, her family had the slightest relief that at least her killer could not harm anyone else. But Larry Peterson would not give up. Even after his direct appeals were exhausted, Larry Peterson didn't stop trying to prove his innocence. Throughout the 1990s, he continued filing post-conviction motions, arguing that there were problems with the evidence used to convict him. Like many inmates at the time, he believed advances in DNA testing could finally answer questions that simply couldn't be answered when he went to trial in 1989. But for years, those requests went nowhere. Courts repeatedly denied his efforts, and he remained behind bars while DNA technology continued to advance. In 1995, the Innocence Project took on Peterson's case and began working to obtain testing of the evidence collected during the investigation. The landscape began to change in 2002 when New Jersey enacted a law allowing people who had already been convicted to seek post-conviction DNA testing under certain circumstances. Peterson filed a motion under that new law, arguing that identity had always been the central issue in this case, and that modern DNA testing could either confirm or refute the state's theory. The trial court denied his request, concluding that he hadn't met the legal requirements. Peterson appealed once again. In December of 2003, the appellate division disagreed with the current standing. The court found that identity had, in fact, been a significant issue at trial and ruled that if DNA testing produced results favorable to Peterson, there was a reasonable probability he would be entitled to a new trial. More than 16 years after Jackie's murder and nearly 15 years after Peterson's conviction, the court finally ordered the evidence to be tested. It was the opportunity Peterson had been seeking for more than a decade, and it would ultimately change the course of the case. With the court's approval finally in hand, the Innocence Project got to work. They partnered with the Serological Research Institute, or SERI, in California to conduct DNA testing on virtually every piece of biological evidence that still existed. Using technology that simply wasn't available at the time of Peterson's trial, Scientists tested the hairs that had played such a significant role in his conviction, the rape kit, Jackie's clothing, and the fingernail scrapings collected during her autopsy. The first results challenged one of the prosecution's strongest pieces of evidence. Every hair that had been attributed to Larry Peterson was determined to belong to Jackie instead. I know that is super surprising, but if you listen to the Judy Lord case, which I recorded back in the fall of 2025, and then just a couple of months later, it came out as being closed and solved, we know from that case that hair testing is junk science, but it was so heavily relied upon back then, and it just makes you wonder how many cases fit this criteria. But the testing didn't stop there. More advanced analysis also detected sperm on the oral, vaginal, and anal swabs collected during Jackie's autopsy. One DNA profile belonged to one of the two men investigators had already determined had consensual sex with Jackie before her murder. A second male DNA profile, however, remained unidentified. That unknown DNA was found on all three swabs, as well as in Jackie's fingernail scrapings, and it did not belong to Larry Peterson. The testing also revealed something else investigators hadn't known before. DNA from the consensual partner was found on Jackie's underwear and jeans, which, essentially she had sexual intercourse and then put those items back on. The unknown male's DNA was not. According to the Innocence Project, that finding was consistent with Jackie putting her clothes back on after the consensual encounter, but not after the sexual assault. Investigators noted that this aligned with how Jackie had been discovered that morning, partially nude near the soybean field. Armed with those findings, Peterson's attorneys returned to court. In July of 2005, Burlington County Superior Court Judge Thomas Smith vacated Larry Peterson's conviction. From the bench, he said there was now, quote, substantial biological evidence that Peterson had not committed the crime. The judge also acknowledged that without the forensic evidence that had been presented in 1989, the state's case looked very different than it had to the original jury. But vacating the conviction did not end the case. Prosecutors announced immediately that they intended to pursue a new trial while they reviewed what evidence remained. For the first time in nearly 17 years, Peterson had a chance to leave prison. There was one problem, though. Bail was set to $250,000, requiring a $25,000 cash bond before he could walk free. According to Peterson and the Innocence Project, his family didn't have that kind of money. His elderly mother ultimately borrowed against her home and went into debt to raise the funds needed to post his bail. Only then, after spending almost 2 decades behind bars for a conviction that had now been overturned, was Peterson able to walk out of prison to await the state's decision on whether to try him again. As the prosecutors prepared for that possibility, the case continued to unravel. The DNA evidence had eliminated the physical evidence that once appeared to place Peterson at the scene. The hair evidence introduced at trial no longer supported the state's theory, and the biological evidence pointed to an unidentified male rather than Peterson. The prosecution was also forced to confront growing problems with one of its most important witnesses, Robert Elder. Elder, whose testimony had provided the jury with the alleged confession, containing details prosecutors argued only the killer could have known, later recanted. He said Peterson had never confessed to him. Instead, Elder claimed that he had been questioned by investigators over the course of 3 days and felt intimidated into giving a statement. He also alleged that detectives left the interrogation room door open while discussing details of the investigation nearby, allowing him to overhear information about the crime. According to Elder, he later repeated those details back to investigators, and they eventually became part of the statement attributed to Peterson. Investigators have denied coercing Elder or feeding him information. And of note, The other two people who were in the car that day have never walked back their statements, though one states he no longer had any recollection. However, and this is big, it should be noted that at the original trial, one aspect the defense had brought up was that the day Jackie's body was found, work records showed that Larry didn't even work that day. And the testimony was that they were all driving to work that morning that she had been murdered. And that's what went into that confession, that he was talking to them on the way into work, which he didn't work that day. So I don't know how more red flags were not drawn then, but that's where it stands. It was known at the original trial. Over the next several months, prosecutors reviewed everything that remained. Without the hair evidence, with an unidentified male DNA profile connected to the assault, and with significant questions surrounding one of their central witnesses, they had to determine whether they could still prove Larry Peterson's guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. On May 26, 2006, they reached their decision. The Burlington County Prosecutor's Office dismissed all charges against Peterson, acknowledging they could no longer meet that burden. Larry Peterson and his family felt they were finally free. For the family of Jackie Harrison, it was pain upon pain. Jackie's daughter Andrea and her father Dwayne told 60 Minutes that they were never even notified that he was going to be released. Andrea said she was also constantly asked to give commentary on her opinion of Larry Peterson. She told 60 Minutes, quote, "It's always been, what do you think about Mr. Peterson? That is not my charge. I care about Jackie. I'm worried about Jackie. What about Jackie?" I commend her honesty. That makes a lot of sense to me. And beyond that messy feeling around Larry Peterson, she also felt afraid. She told 60 Minutes, quote, "You go back into fight or flight. Who's the person? Who hurt my mother? What happened to Jackie? Who did it? Whoever that person is, they're still out there." At the time of the overturned conviction, Jackie's sister Patricia told NPR, quote, "DNA didn't prove anything. All it proved was that he wasn't there," end quote. To her, the DNA evidence answered one question, but it left the most important one unanswered: who killed Jackie? For Dwayne Jones, Andrea's father and long-term partner of Jackie, he told the Wall Street Journal that he believed people in Jackie's tough social circle and small community at the time had something to do with her murder. And he described how that was a disturbing feeling to him. He said, quote, "They're breaking bread with you and still keeping this big, deep, dark secret," end quote. As I started looking into whether anyone else had ever been considered a viable suspect in Jackie's murder, I came across an interesting detail in Larry Peterson's later federal lawsuit seeking compensation for his wrongful conviction. In that lawsuit, Peterson claimed he gave investigators the names of 3 local men that he believed warranted additional investigation. He alleged that one man, Hassan, had attended a party at a nearby housing development on the night Jackie was murdered. He also identified Kenneth and James, 2 men who had reportedly been arrested by Hamilton Township police in connection with a series of robberies. Peterson argued that law enforcement failed to adequately investigate those leads. It's important to note that these claims come from Peterson's lawsuit. The investigators disputed his characterization of the investigation, and none of these men were ever publicly charged or identified by authorities as suspects in Jackie's murder. To round out my final commentary on Larry Peterson, he largely stayed out of the public eye after his exoneration. In 2013, he was briefly charged with allegedly threatening to kill a former girlfriend, but those charges were later dismissed. His civil lawsuit over his wrongful conviction was eventually resolved through a $1 million settlement. Nearly 4 decades have passed since Jackie Harrison was murdered. And despite everything that's happened, the most important question remains unanswered. Who killed Jackie? Her family has now endured 2 separate tragedies. The first was losing Jackie in such a brutal and senseless way. The second was believing for nearly 20 years that they had justice, only to learn that the person convicted of her murder could no longer be tied to the crime. Today, they're left where they started, still waiting for answers, still wondering who took Jackie from them, and still hoping that one day someone will be held accountable. Unlike many older cases, this investigation still has something incredibly valuable: DNA evidence. While it has already helped identify a wrongful conviction, it may also hold the key to identifying the person who actually killed Jackie. Advances in forensic science continue to happen every year, and techniques like investigative genetic genealogy have solved cases once thought impossible, sometimes decades after the crimes were committed. Whether those methods are ultimately used in Jackie's case is a decision for investigators, but the possibility offers hope that this story doesn't have to end here. So today, I hope you'll remember Jackie for more than the circumstances of her death. Remember that she was a daughter, a sister, a mother, and someone whose life mattered long before she became the victim in a homicide investigation. If you recognize anything about this case, if you know something you've never shared, or if hearing Jackie's story sparks a memory you've dismissed for years, I encourage you to come forward. Every unsolved case is only unsolved until the day it isn't, and after all these years, Jackie Harrison and the people who love her still deserve that day. If you have any information on the murder of Jackie Harrison in New Jersey in 1987, please contact the New Jersey Crime Stoppers at 973-267-2255 or the Burlington Township Anonymous Tip Line at 609-386-2019. This has been another episode of A Simpler Time True Crime. If you appreciate the work I'm doing on this podcast, please just go over to the listening platform you're listening on and leave a review. If you're listening on Apple, if you could leave a written review too, that would be so helpful. Also, word of mouth helps me grow tremendously. So sharing with a friend, sharing it on your social media, it really adds up and helps spread the podcast to people who need to listen to it. Case suggestions can be made to simplertimecrimepod@gmail.com. And make sure you follow me on Instagram. You can DM me case suggestions on there as well. And each week I post bonus content as well as all of the pictures that go along with the episode. As always, thank you so much for listening, and I'll see you again next Monday.